Chapter 8. The real war begins. No serious consideration was given towards the mental health and well-being of any of the soldiers who participated in the vigorous ground campaign of the 2003 Iraq War. Before our return to Germany, I can recall that we were reunited with the rest of the Irish Guards in a temporary camp named Matilda, and that there was a mobile shower facility there. This would be our first shower in months, and that's all I can really remember about this place. This camp was a movement control checkpoint, and in good old-fashioned military manner, we had to be processed, and all weapons and equipment had to be accounted for. The final checkpoint we had to enter was with the doctor, and this would be the only post-operational stress assessment that we would receive. And it was conducted in the open, without any confidentiality whatsoever. Soldier G recalls that we were all lined up outside a small 9x9 tent, and as we passed through, the doctor would ask us if we were feeling okay. There was no privacy on the other side of the tent. Once you'd signed off on your own self-certified mental health evaluation, of course. There were beers and a party waiting for us. Naturally, everyone said that they were okay, as we all wanted to relax and get drunk. One must not dismiss the fact that we were all trained, conditioned even, to ignore and suppress our emotions, our feelings. What soldier would ever admit to being weak after what we had just experienced, especially in the company of their comrades? I often look back and question the strategic thinking of this, and what could have, or should have, been in place. I ask the unproductive question of, what if more emphasis was targeted towards the mental well-being of these soldiers? Particularly my men, the men of 23 Charlie. Maybe with adequate mental health aftercare, we could have managed our battlefield trauma before it spiraled out of control into something far worse. When I passed through this psychological operational stress checkpoint, I thought that it would be funny to joke about my own mental health. When the doctor asked me if I was feeling okay, I replied with, "Absolutely fine, apart from the constant bedwetting and nightmares." I could hear my men laugh, but the doctor didn't see the funny side. He then persisted with further questions and asked me to elaborate. Maybe this was a subconscious cry for help, but I was holding up the line and was getting booed by the rest of the lads who just wanted a beer. I informed the doctor that it was just a badly timed prank, signed my own mental health evaluation, and got blind drunk with the rest of the battalion. This was just a paper exercise, and even back then, it felt like a token gesture. When reflecting back on the operational stress and pressures that were put on all of us and what we had endured, it is no surprise that we would all eventually suffer with poor mental health. From the very beginning, soldiers accept the very real danger of death and injury. Then, add into the equation the imminent risk of biological and chemical weapons being deployed against us, which, of course, escalated to the retaliatory threat of nuclear weapons by George W. Bush, the fierce fighting we had witnessed, and, of course, the darker side of warfare. Civilians. The accepted collateral damage. The majority of 23 Charlie were teenagers, and this was their first operational tour. We were thrown into a hard-fought attrition ground campaign that saw the most intense fighting of our generation. In the First World War, it was referred to as shell shock. In the Second World War, it was referred to as battlefield fatigue. And in more modern times, PTSD. One would rightly imagine that we would receive adequate mental health training after self-certifying ourselves in Iraq. However, regrettably, we would be mistaken. On return to our barracks in Munster, no sooner had we departed the coaches on the drill square that the party continued. That night Dave informed me that after I had deployed early to Kuwait, some of the Northern Irish lads from the drums and pipes platoon had conducted some kind of Ulster initiation on him and a few of the other lads prior to their deployment. This consisted of being blindfolded and swearing allegiance to the Orange Men of Ulster. Both Tommy and Pez recall that we had all been drinking heavily and made our way to the lines of the drums and pipes platoon for vengeance. Rather than having an all-out inter-platoon brawl, it was decided that Dave would fight in a bare-knuckle boxing match with Jimmy, the Guardsman, who had prepared his Ulster initiation before the war. In the 5 months that I'd known Dave, he'd grown from a quiet, shy young man into someone who had reverted to what could only be described as a primeval state of mind. Dave had never boxed before, and it was pretty evident from the start of the bout that Jimmy had done quite a bit. Dave couldn't land a single blow, and was repeatedly punched to the ground. This wasn't a traditional bout. There weren't any rules, no points, or even a towel. It was simply last man standing. Dave was getting hit with combination after combination of punches, yet continued to drive forward without even putting his guard up. With his face bloodied and bruised, Dave was knocked down again. But yet again, though, he rose to his feet and let out a loud primal howl, at which the men of 10 Platoon all cheered in encouragement. Maybe Jimmy was tiring, but Dave managed to get in close and grab him in a bear hug-type grip. Then, like a barbarian, proceeded to bite a big chunk of flesh out of his shoulder. Jimmy screamed in agonizing pain as Dave spat his flesh out. But Dave was by no means finished with him yet. Dave then lifted Jimmy off the ground and rammed both of them through a wardrobe. Jimmy screeched out in pain again and was the first to rise, but it was evident that he had badly broken his arm and was unable to continue. Dave was triumphant by default. We raised Dave above our shoulders and paraded him around the company lines as he was our new champion, our hero. Retrospective analysis can be very dangerous and unproductive, as this incident alone should have set off dozens of red flags. Initially, Dave's whole character had changed, and he was becoming a heavy drinker and would continue to use violence as a coping mechanism to deny his deteriorating mental health. Before Iraq, Ski was teetotal. But like Dave, after the war, he also turned to alcohol to help him process, then suppress, his battlefield trauma. I was also struggling to process our battlefield experiences, and was not adequately trained to identify or even be aware of the signs of PTSD in my men, or in myself for that matter. This is a burden that I still carry with me, as in hindsight, all of the signs were there in plain sight, yet I couldn't or didn't want to acknowledge them at the time. In further reflection, Pez, who at the start of the war had a personality that was the polar opposite to Dave's, gradually withdrew to a more dormant temperament. Initially he was upbeat and excited about the conflict, but as the war progressed, he slowly became withdrawn and even reverted to referring to myself by my rank, which I was totally against. Before the war in Iraq, Pez had been one of my good friends, and I should have identified this change in his character as a significant consequence of his own battlefield trauma. Yet no training was available at the time, and the generic solution to mental health problems was to man up. This toxic alpha male culture of denying the existence of poor mental health of the British Army at this time was institutionally instilled into us, and as a result, some of us, myself included, would be ticking time bombs. Trauma risk management training would be introduced for my final operational tour in Afghanistan in 2010. But this was 2003, and a million miles away. It is far too obvious when conducting retrospective analysis that we need counselling or group therapy to help us aid in processing and accepting our battlefield trauma, and I believe that this would have been beneficial. Nevertheless, we had beer and each other, and that was the best practice and only available treatment at the time. Then there are the men of the drums and pipes to consider. Let us not forget that they were mourning the death of two of their brothers. We didn't even stop to think about how the war had affected them. And in hindsight, I'm appalled by this. However, due to our numb, emotionless mindset at that time, frankly, we didn't care. No disciplinary action or charges were ever pursued over this illegal bout. This was just our way, the traditional army way of managing post-operational stress in that period. I'm not a therapist, but getting blind drunk and brawling may feel like it releases stress at the time, but this never actually deals with the real issues and the basis of the underlying trauma. In my case, I would continue to use work as a coping mechanism along with alcohol as a tool to suppress my own inner suffering. I would not be able to just have a couple of drinks. I would have to get blind drunk at every opportunity. At the beginning of the 21st century, the British Army had a detrimental drinking culture, and like many others of my generation, I hid my internal pain at the bottom of an empty glass, and this was particularly bad within the sergeant's mess. This culture would continue to be accepted, especially as the high-intensity counter-insurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan gathered pace. Furthermore, it was not uncommon for sergeants' mess members to be late for work or fail outright to turn up. Yet this was accepted despite being thoroughly unprofessional at the time. Consideration must also be given to the increase in the operational tempo that had occurred after the events of 9/11. The British Army had global operational commitments in Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Balkans, as well as humanitarian and diplomatic commitments to uphold. Then on top of this, the Queen's Guards were also responsible for conducting ceremonial duties at the royal palaces and residences in between these deployments. For the Irish Guards, we completed a unit move to London in the weeks after returning from Iraq, where we would be hurled into the stressful environment of public duties. I have never particularly enjoyed donning on the iconic scarlet tunic and bearskin, due to the simple fact that it was manpower intensive and highly stressful. Additionally, the battalion had been stationed in Germany for 5 years, where foot drill was considered a prohibited and dirty word, as our focus was exclusively orientated towards combat operations. On our return to the UK, we all imagined that we would be welcomed back as heroes. However, our delusions of grandeur were a far cry from the truth. The anti-war movement was at its peak in the summer of 2003, and we were now public enemy number one, as we had just returned from the war. Let us not forget that we were conducting the changing of the guard on a daily basis, and were an easy target for the press and these anti-war campaigners. There was public outrage at the lack of evidence of WMDs, as this had been the main justification for Britain's participation in the war to begin with. We were frequently abused by the public, and extra police protection was required when we conducted our ceremonial duties. Chants of "baby killers" were frequently screamed at us by these activists, and for some of us, including myself, this felt just. This would further exacerbate my deteriorating mood, and it wasn't just limited to London. I can recall being up north in Manchester at a friend's house when, as soon as a mutual friend discovered that I had returned from Iraq, the "baby killer" chants started. I was overwhelmed with guilt from my part in the war, and was still traumatized by that airstrike. I would argue with myself and conclude that maybe I was a baby killer after all. But then I would get blind drunk, and this would help me forget. I would proceed to shut myself off from the outside world and concentrate on my job as my own coping mechanism. In the investigation that followed the war in Iraq, Mr. Blair stated in the 2016 Chilcot inquiry that he believed that the assessed intelligence had established beyond doubt that Saddam Hussein had continued to produce chemical and biological weapons, that he continues in his efforts to develop nuclear weapons, and that he had been able to extend the range of his ballistic missile program. The key word here is believed. And being the very astute politician that he is, Blair directed the responsibility of blame towards the intelligence community. As a result, the British Army were thrown to the will of the mob as scapegoats in a political masterclass by Blair to avoid all personal accountability for the perceived illegal war. In the years that followed, all British soldiers were vilified by the public and the media. For soldiers such as myself, we continued to question our actions during the war, and although I consciously accept that we were acting on behalf of the British people through Blair, this doubt, to a certain degree, still remains. That September, I was promoted to the rank of Lance Sergeant and became an established member of the Sergeant's Mess. This fast track into the Sergeant's Mess gave me such pride and, let us not forget, a new status and identity. Once part of the Sergeant's Mess, your whole perception changes within the battalion. One day I was eating my lunch with my men from Iraq in the cookhouse. The next day I was sitting opposite the regimental sergeant major, having breakfast in his mess. I was now in the big leagues. It is within the confines of the sergeant's mess where most of the inner working problems of the battalion are resolved. I had worked hard in Iraq and had earned my reward and wanted more. I justified the horrors of war, many that still haunt me to this day, through that extra chevron and that promotion to the mess. At the time, I genuinely believed that it had all been worth it. Now, however, not so much. It wasn't long after my promotion when I experienced my first panic attack, but as a new member of the Sergeant's Mess, I was too afraid to seek help. Too ashamed. To this day, I still do not understand why this panic attack occurred, as I was not in any immediate danger, and I was never afraid of a fight. Still, Observing that brawl from the other side of the street in the confines of my moving car was significantly painful. I experienced a tightness of the chest and had trouble breathing. My vision became blurred and I was struggling to drive my car. I was a brave, courageous soldier who insisted on leading his men from the front. I would always be the first one to run directly into a firefight, the first to lead my men when breaching compounds. And now, I was experiencing genuine fear. The type that completely overwhelms you, then shuts your body down. I needed help. I needed the men of 23 Charlie. Without them, I felt naked and vulnerable. Weak. All I could do was fight this head on, and told myself to man the fuck up. And once I made it to the confines of the sergeant's mess in Wellington Barracks, I finally felt safe and began to relax. Besides, sergeants were not weak. And I was a war hero, wasn't I? I would use this new identity as a false persona to hide my own battlefield pain, and lied to myself to convince my subconscious that my new identity was different from my previous rank and, therefore, I was not accountable for what had happened in Iraq at the hands of Lance Corporal Watson. Being stationed in central London also aided me in masking my pain, as, in this vibrant city, you can party and drink 24/7. And that is exactly what we all did. It then became routine to party in the sergeant's mess bar afterwards, as it was open all hours. This was a standard and acceptable practice at the time, and, in hindsight, very unproductive. The bar would be open from 12 to 1400 hours throughout the working day, and it was not uncommon for members to have a couple of pints over lunch before returning to work. There was no evening cut-off time for last orders, and the bar would stay open until the last member was finished drinking. For those of us who had witnessed the darker side of warfare, the accepted drinking culture of the sergeant's mess would provide us with an outlet to suppress our battlefield trauma. No matter how drunk we were, or how much trouble we got into, not once was the question asked as to why. Years later, when I was the battalion welfare officer, this would be my first question when soldiers were sent to me with alcohol-related issues. Back then, though, there was an unwritten rule of what happens in the sergeant's mess stays in the sergeant's mess. And this acceptance of drunken antics was detrimental to the long-term mental health of my generation of soldiers. My section second-in-command, Stevie, would be assigned to the regimental recruiting team on return to London, and that was the last I ever saw of him. In a recent interview, he stated that he felt alone and isolated once he had left 10 Platoon, and didn't know why. On leaving the army, there was no interview with a doctor. In fact, the doctor was sick that day. So one of the medics processed him, and that was that. No questions were ever asked concerning his mental well-being or about his time in Iraq. Stevie then informed me that he had a panic attack soon after leaving the army when applying for a mortgage. He said that the whole experience was overwhelming, and he didn't know how to cope with life outside of the military. He went on to tell me how angry and violent he felt after his service, as this was not in his character before he joined the ranks of the British Army. In the years that followed, Stevie gradually shut down socially and began to blame everyone else for all of his issues. Unfortunately, he would end up being arrested after an altercation with his boss at work. He regrettably explained that he had blacked out with rage and went into full combat mode, and that if he hadn't been stopped, He may have killed his boss. This was his new mentality, and he couldn't understand why. Veterans for Peace UK argue that most military personnel and veterans are not habitually violent, but, as a result of their training and experiences, they are more likely than civilians to behave violently in daily life. Stevie is an excellent example of this. Fortunately, Stevie was saved by a local veteran who ran a boxing gym. Boxing, and then later weight training, would allow him to exhaust his anger and then vent his controlled aggression through intensive exercise. Sadly, even to this day, Stevie is still angry and doesn't know why. He says that when it comes on, he has to withdraw from people and only feels better once he has lifted excessively large weights. I spoke to him about my own experiences and urged him to seek professional help, only to be informed that he did reach out many years ago to a local charity, but they didn't pursue it. I am now hopeful he will engage with some professional therapist in the near future, as I believe that he needs to resolve the battlefield trauma that we all experienced during our time in Iraq. Furthermore, in 2013, Stevie collapsed after losing a substantial amount of weight. He was relieved to be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, as he had suspected the worst and thought that it may have been cancer. He was 29 years old at the time and in good health. This was not the usual age bracket to be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Something was off. Besides, he was fit and healthy with no family history of diabetes. Further research would conclude that the onset of type 1 diabetes was a side effect of the anthrax injections that we had all received prior to the war in 2003. After an 18-month court battle, the Ministry of Defence would accept liability and award Stevie with a 40% medical pension. In a US study of anthrax vaccinations that were given to American soldiers from 2008, it was found that there were 1,074 related side effects of type 1 diabetes. No warning was ever given to us before these injections, and as a direct consequence, Stevie now has to manage his life around his medical condition. Stevie then asked about the men of 23 Charlie, particularly Dave. He then informed me that when looking back at our time in Iraq, there were times when he felt genuinely afraid of Dave. He mentioned how Dave would stare right through you, like he wanted to kill you, and had genuine concerns about his state of mind in retrospect when discussing the war. I explained that we had lost contact, but in hindsight, that I had failed him as a commander, as the signs of battlefield trauma were staring me in the face. He then asked about whether an incident had actually occurred where a little girl had come to us with severe gunshot wounds for medical attention. Once I confirmed this, Stevie was relieved. He mentioned how his time in Iraq had become vague, and that over the years he had questioned his memories and had suppressed them. He was having trouble differentiating flashbacks from the truth, and as a result, he had forgotten about his own battlefield exploits. He continued to tell me that his only real memories were before and after the war, and that he vividly remembers the Irish Guards commanding officer chatting to us both after the war at Camp Matilda. Nagsy, as he referred to him, had previously been my company commander, and was without doubt the best officer that I knew. He genuinely cared about the men and could really inspire you. He was a true leader. Stevie recalls how we spoke proudly about our section's actions during the war, and that we had been at the forefront of some of the most intense fighting. I can recall most of our combat experiences in Iraq, but had mentally shut down once we arrived at Camp Matilda in Kuwait. Maybe this was battlefield fatigue setting in, or the start of my own PTSD. I didn't want to return home. I didn't feel like I was a hero. I fundamentally believed that I deserved to die on that battlefield for my hand in that airstrike. The death and mutilation of those innocent families that we had witnessed would haunt the men of 23 Charlie after the war, and, in some cases, completely ruin their lives. On return from Iraq, I explicitly recommended that Ski should attend a junior non-commissioned officer cadre. He was an excellent soldier, and I had every confidence in his ability to lead, and he passed with ease. I was proud. Ski was promoted to the rank of Lance Corporal, but would regrettably be reassigned to No. 1 Company. This was a new policy that was introduced to help freshly promoted junior commanders adapt to their new role in management. It was thought that their friends within their previous platoons would be too familiar with them. Thus, on promotion, Ski was forced out of 4 Company. This was not always the case, as I was fortunate enough to rise through the ranks of 10 Platoon and would complete 5 of my 6 operational tours with the fine men of 4 Company. I also believe that this familiarity aided me along the way. Sadly, Ski would be traumatized by the events that we had all encountered in Iraq, particularly the darker side of warfare. Ski wrote, "Because we were the initial fighting force, we didn't stop to mess around with dead bodies, Iraqis. There was a little girl clinging onto her dead dad, screaming her eyes out. We never had time to stop. We just pushed on past, as the next line of soldiers behind us would sort it out." On the 30th of November 2004, police in Birmingham would arrest Ski on suspicion of stealing an SA-80 assault rifle from Wellington Barracks in London. Ski's mental health had deteriorated to such a degree that he was living off Pro Plus caffeine pills to keep him awake. He refused to sleep, as this kept him from his nightmares. He was suffering flashbacks from the trauma that we all had witnessed, and didn't know how to process or even manage this internal pain. Ski would be diagnosed with a personality disorder and thrown to the wolves due to the negative national press that had surrounded his court case. Regrettably, I wasn't there to help Ski at a time when he could only feel safe by having a rifle by his side. I can relate to this mentality, as when I had my first panic attack the previous year, I needed my section, the men of 23 Charlie around me, to keep me safe from my own irrational thoughts. A parliamentary report from the 1st of September 2004 would conclude that of all the soldiers who had served in Iraq in its initial year, only 52 had suffered from PTSD. The report states, over the period January 2003 to February 2004, the latest dates for which figures are available, 461 military personnel who served in Iraq were recorded as having experienced mental health problems. This represents 0.7% of those who had returned from deployment in Iraq at that time. Of these, 52 personnel were codified under the International Codification of Disease System as having post-traumatic stress disorder. I find these figures baffling, to say the least, as PTSD does not go away and cannot be miraculously cured. I cannot help but assume that these figures of a mere 52 personnel diagnosed with PTSD was set aside to appease the politicians. Maybe it was to help Mr. Blair sleep at night. These figures would only account for onset battlefield trauma that, if treated immediately, can offset the lasting damage of PTSD. But this treatment or policy simply did not exist in 2003. Then there is the medium term, and then, finally, the more damaging long-term effects of battlefield trauma, which are not even considered in this report. It affects every soldier differently, and is unique to their life experiences and operational deployments. As for the remaining 409 personnel who had experienced poor mental health in this period, were they just sad, stressed, or had anxiety? Maybe, like Ski, they had a personality disorder. And if that is the case, why are recruits not psychologically tested before they are allowed to join the British Army? In an interview with the BBC in 2018, Professor Simon Wesley, Regius Professor of Psychiatry at King's College London, pointed out that there was now less stigma attached to poor mental health and PTSD, and that it used to take people maybe 10 to 13 years to come forward for treatment. Now that's down to around 2 to 3 years. I am pleased to hear that the stigma and shame regarding mental health and PTSD is now on the decline. But even 2 to 3 years is not acceptable. My generation, as Wesley rightly alludes to, would not openly admit to themselves or others that they were struggling with their mental health, especially PTSD, and as a result, suffered in silence. Maybe this was an issue within society, as there was a changing of the guard in how the British Army operated in the following years. It gradually became more professional and acknowledged the impact that warfare has on our mental health. The chain of command, including medical personnel, was about to enter a 10-year period of high-intensity operational deployments, where boots on the ground were often prioritized over the mental health of its soldiers. For the men of 10 Platoon, and the Irish Guards in general, our feet were yet to touch the ground for a split second in this 12-month period. No sooner had we returned from Iraq than we would find ourselves deploying on another operational tour that very same year. Before the war in Iraq, the battalion was scheduled to deploy on an operational tour to Northern Ireland in the September of 2003. This had been put back to October as a consequence, and now we had to rush through our pre-deployment training. 5 months after returning from war, I would be deployed in South Armagh again. In the 6 years since I was last in South Armagh, the Irish Guards had drastically changed. Junior commanders, such as Frank, Soldier G, and myself, were battle-hardened, and the old ways of gaining forced respect through bullying, fear, and violence were being gradually weeded out. We were approachable, and valued and respected the Guardsman. During our Northern Ireland training, it was mandatory to complete a judgmental exercise with the Royal Military Police, RMPs. This was essentially a huge arcade game with converted SA-80 rifles, and I remember that none of my men were taking it seriously. The concept is quite simple. Different video scenarios are played out on a huge screen to your front, and 2 soldiers at a time react as if they would if deployed on operations. Then the RMP would play back the scenario and point out all, if any, of their mistakes. Pez and Greenie were rolling on the floor and attempting to shoot the tyres off a terrorist's vehicle, by which the RMP were not impressed. For argument's sake, and to wind up the RMP, I supported my Guardsman's decision. The rules of engagement are completely different in Northern Ireland than in times of war, and it was obvious that we were all a little trigger-happy and not taking our training seriously. This juvenile approach would stay with us throughout the tour, and I can look back at this time with fond memories. Our brief training package was intense but fun. In fact, the whole tour to Northern Ireland was extremely enjoyable and was a lifetime away from my first deployment in South Armagh in 1997. Yes, the same operational demands and stresses were there, but these were minuscule compared to what we had experienced in Iraq earlier on in that year. Plus, all of the terror organizations had almost ceased all aggressive activities since the events of 9/11, after the US had declared its war on terror. Once deployed, 10 Platoon was stationed at a patrol base in a small border town called Forkhill. I would be working closely with Wade again, as he was now my logistics manager, or company quartermaster sergeant, CQMS. As expected, Wade was still diligent and professional, and I thoroughly respected him. When we initially arrived at our new home in Forkhill, I remember him being specifically astonished and taken back about how expensive some of the large salient cameras cost, as several of these would be on his logistics account. Me being me, I joked about how I didn't want to be with him, with that amount of responsibility, how £4 million per camera was a lot, and that he better not lose one. To my surprise, Wade was smiling. This wasn't good. I knew that smile. Wade then kindly informed me that I would be responsible for 4 of the 6 of these cameras at the huge observation post called Romeo Tower, number 21. Romeo 21. Suddenly, with my newfound £16 million worth of responsibility, I wasn't joking anymore. He then continued that I would also be Romeo 21's tower commander, and as such, I would be a smaller logistical manager on this small observation base. I wasn't happy. I remember noticing there was a distinct difference in command styles on this Christmas operational tour of South Armagh. There were those who had been previously deployed to Iraq or Kosovo, and, let's just say, were more relaxed about being in Forkhill. Then there were the traditional commanders who had only experienced tours of Northern Ireland and found themselves being overly stressed at every opportunity. This was by no fault of their own, but how they believed low-level commanders should act from their previous experiences. This outlook had been inherited from their previous commanders, and it was obvious that times were changing, and for the better. 10 Platoon would spend 2 to 3 weeks at a time at the patrol base in Forkhill, before rotating to the solitude of the watchtowers at Romeo 21. This small observation base consisted of ISO containers that had been linked together, almost like giant Lego bricks. It had 2 helipads and was located on top of Slieve Gullion, a steep-sided mountain with an impressive height of 1,880 feet. The naturally occurring flat top on this mountain would provide us with excellent fields of observation, and with the use of the salient cameras, would allow us to see for miles around in all weather conditions. These huge cameras were motion-activated and were state-of-the-art for 2003. Our job was simple. When stationed in Romeo 21, gain intelligence of suspected players, terrorists, observe and report. We were always professional, but had fun at the same time, and may, or may not, have misused some of this high-tech, multi-million-pound equipment for our own amusement in the process. My best friend Frank had missed the war as he was still instructing recruits at ATR Pirbright, but was now back in 4 Company, in 11 Platoon. Frank would be doing the same job as myself, but at a smaller observation patrol base called Golf 40, G40. As always, we were in competition, and his responsibilities were less than mine, and I frequently enjoyed reminding him of this. He had just the 1 helipad, whereas I had 2. He had 1 observation tower, whereas I had 4, and it didn't stop there. The shenanigans were coming in thick and fast from all directions. No one was safe. The chief instigator was usually my good friend John Corcoran. He would have a hand in all of the mischievous activity that would occur. He'd been assigned to 10 Platoon as a multiple commander for the deployment, and I was glad, as like Frank, I thought of him as a brother. My beloved MCFC mug was initially mug-napped, and I would receive ransom notes and pictures of it in different locations around South Armagh. Furthermore, my office phone in my bunk would ring at all hours with prank phone calls. This was generally Ski, Mac, Pez, or Ricky, or at least I suspected it was them, as I never really found out. The pranks were so bad that even when the commanding officer called the main Sanger of Romeo 21 to congratulate us on doing such a great job, Pez didn't believe him and rudely hung up. Nagsy then rang my office/bunk phone and asked me to thank the team, and thankfully saw the funny side. Besides the shenanigans, we had the right balance of professionalism, a diligent work ethic, and a better working environment. In fact, this operational deployment felt more like a holiday with your mates, and looking back, it was some of the best times in my career. The only way to access these observation patrol bases was by helicopter, and as such, we would be required to return our waste and food swill once a fortnight. Frank and I were responsible for packaging this waste into cargo nets for the helicopters to remove as unslung loads. We would often use these salient cameras to stalk each other on the helipads, either receiving supplies or returning them. These helicopters were like our very own Amazon Prime, and we would utilize them for our own amusement. On one such sortie, I had accidentally left Romeo 21's waste for a week on the helipad in the rain. This was generally packed in plastic bags, in an outer cardboard box, then wrapped in a cargo net. I had requested that the helicopter drop it at Frank's location at Golf 40, knowing full well that the cardboard would collapse and the swill from the kitchen would burst all over Frank, and it didn't disappoint. Myself, John and Frankie were the 3 amigos, good friends who were as thick as thieves. I remember that John in particular was overly excited as we observed our prank unfold on one of the salient cameras 4 miles away. The plan worked perfectly, and as the helicopter dropped the unslung load on Frank's helipad, it collapsed, covering Frank with food waste. As one could imagine, Frank was not impressed and was out for revenge. But he never found out who sent him that unslung load. Well, at least until now, that is. We secretly fed John with protein powder, and as there were no mirrors in the gym, we convinced him that he was bulking up with muscle, when in fact, he was just getting fat. John's wife, Sarah, didn't see the funny side when her husband returned home with excessive lard, and we would continue to laugh and joke about this in the years that followed. Fork Hill had a tiny sauna in a broom cupboard, and this is where I had my biggest victory over Frank to date. Several of us overcrowded ourselves into the sauna and decided to put the heat up in an attempt to see who was the toughest. This was a game of last man standing. It was no surprise that Frank, John and I were the last 3, and were all literally feeling the heat. Then out of nowhere, John pulled out a bottle of vodka and poured it on the rocks. This instantaneously burnt our eyes and airways, and John exited the sauna, realizing that he'd made a mistake. It was down to the last two, and I was feeling the pressure. I began to play mind games with Frank and told him that I would rather pass out than admit defeat to him, and that I was fine. This was far from the truth, as I was just about to quit when Frank exited the sauna. So I was victorious and promptly followed him out, almost on his back. I was generally disappointed when the operational tour came to an end, as it never felt like actual work. I have fond memories of our time in Forkhill, and I believe that this was a welcome distraction from our experiences in the war in Iraq. Whilst deployed in South Armagh, I was able to mask my pain by focusing solely on my duties, and would continue to do this for the rest of my career. On my return to the mainland, I would be assigned to the Infantry Training Centre, Catterick, as a recruit instructor for the following 2 years. For the men that I'd commanded in Iraq, this would be the last time I would see Ski, Pez, Mac, and let us not forget that Stevie had already transitioned into Civvy Street. Pez would go absent without leave whilst on a sailing expedition from Argentina to Australia. He would be arrested in 2010 and given an immediate discharge without serving any jail time. Mac would unfortunately be a casualty in a severe road traffic accident in Kenya, which resulted in a medical discharge. As for Ski, I believe that if he had been kept with the men of 10 Platoon for that tour, we could have helped him. But maybe that's the optimist in me. Regardless, no decompression, or mental health evaluations, or awareness training for that matter, was conducted despite us deploying twice on operations within a 12-month period. In hindsight, this is an institutional failure, and would be justified by the operational intensity over the coming years. The Ministry of Defence would prioritise the operational needs over that of the individual soldiers, and disregard their mental health and overall well-being in the process. The British Army's needs were always the priority. And, as the indoctrinated soldiers that we were, we unconditionally bought into this rhetoric, as the Army's needs became our own. We were selfless.